The barrel of Homer Hunter's revolver pressed cold against Dorothy Garrison's temple, and his hand was shaking for the first time in 11 years of wearing a badge beneath his shirt. "Tell me it's a lie," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "Tell me you did not poison Marshal Ainsworth. Tell me you did not steal the Wells Fargo gold. Tell me, Dorothy, and I will lower this gun and we will ride away from Cheyenne together, and none of the rest will matter." Dorothy did not flinch. Her green eyes, rimmed with the dust of 3 days' riding, held steady on his. Behind her, the burning barn cast long orange shadows across the prairie grass, and somewhere in the smoke a horse screamed. "I never lied to you, Homer," she said. "Not once. Everything I told you about the ledgers, about Cornelius Vance, about what he did to my father's ranch, that was truth. If you pull that trigger, you will be killing the only person in this territory who can prove your captain is the man who murdered Ainsworth." His finger tightened on the trigger. 3 men lay dead behind him already this week. Men who had trusted him because he wore the tin star of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Men who had never known his real name was not Homer Boyle, the drifter, but Homer Hunter, the agent sent to bring Dorothy Garrison to justice or to a grave, whichever came first. "I have a warrant," he said, "signed by a federal judge. Every charge against you is real." "Then why?" Dorothy asked, and her voice did not tremble though tears cut clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. "Are your hands shaking, Agent Hunter?" The rain had not yet come to answer him. The fire cracked. And somewhere in the roaring dark of that burning barn outside Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, Homer Hunter's entire understanding of duty, of justice, and of his own hardened heart began to collapse like a rotten fence post in a flood. That moment did not come from nothing. It came from 6 weeks of lies, 6 weeks of longing, and one single truth Homer had not yet let himself believe. 6 weeks earlier, Homer Hunter had ridden into the town of Larkspur Creek, Wyoming territory, with dust on his boots and a false name on his tongue. It was April of 1878, and the Union Pacific had brought a flood of gamblers, con men, and desperate settlers to that stretch of high plains, all chasing the promise of the railroad and the cattle money that followed it. The Pinkerton agency had sent Homer west with a single assignment folded into his breast pocket, a photograph clipped from a wanted poster, and a name that had become a curse across 3 counties, Dorothy Garrison. The charges against her were long enough to hang a dozen men. Theft of $20,000 in Wells Fargo gold shipments. The poisoning of United States Marshal Thaddeus Ainsworth, found dead in his hotel room with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. Conspiracy with outlaws to derail a Union Pacific payroll car outside Rock Springs. The agency file called her dangerous, cunning, and without conscience. It said she had been seen at every crime scene, always slipping away before the law arrived, always leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of gun, oil, and leather. Homer had read that file 100 times on the train west, and he had built in his mind a woman as hard and cold as the Badlands themselves. He pictured a gunslinger with dead eyes and a killer's patience. He did not expect what he found instead. He found her behind the counter of Garrison Ironworks and Gunsmithing, the only forge and gun shop for 40 miles, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her dark auburn hair pulled back beneath a leather cap, and her hands black with soot as she worked a rifle barrel over an anvil with the precision of a surgeon. She did not look up when the bell above the door rang. "If you are here for a repair, leave your gun on the counter and your business outside," she said. "If you are here to gawk, the saloon is 3 doors down and they will gladly take your money for the privilege." Homer had crossed half the territory chasing rumors and false trails to find this woman, and in the space of 10 seconds she had already put him in his place. He found himself almost smiling. "I am here for repair," he said, setting his revolver on the counter, a lie sitting easy on his tongue the way lies always had. "Name is Homer Boyle. I heard the gunsmith in Larkspur Creek was the best this side of Cheyenne. Dorothy finally looked up, and Homer felt the full weight of her gaze settle on him like a physical thing. Her eyes were a deep forest green, sharp and assessing, the eyes of a woman who had learned long ago that trusting too quickly could get a person killed. She studied his revolver, then his face, then his hands in that order, and Homer understood in that instant that she was reading him the way he had been trained to read other men. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Whoever told you that was not wrong?" she said, and picked up his revolver, turning the cylinder with a practiced flick of her wrist. "Your firing pin is worn near to nothing. Another 50 rounds and it would have failed you at the worst possible moment. Lucky for you, Mr. Boyle, I keep spare parts on hand for exactly this kind of neglect." "Neglect," Homer repeated. "I would call it hard use." "I would call it a man who does not respect the tools that keep him alive," Dorothy said, and there was no malice in it, only a plain, unhurried honesty that Homer had not expected from a woman the agency file described as a cold-blooded conspirator. "Come back tomorrow afternoon. It will be ready." He should have left it there. He should have taken his revolver, walked out, and begun the slow work of surveillance from a distance, the way he had been trained. Instead, he lingered at the counter a moment longer than was wise. "You run this place alone?" he asked. Something flickered behind her eyes, gone before he could name it. "My father built this forge with his own hands in '69. He passed it to me when his lungs gave out from the coal smoke 2 years back. I run it alone because I choose to, not because I have no other options." "Never said you did," Homer said. "No," Dorothy said, "but most men think it anyway. Good day, Mr. Boyle." He walked out into the dusty street of Larkspur Creek, with his heart beating faster than it had any right to. And he told himself it was only the strangeness of the assignment, the disorientation of finding a suspected murderer running an honest business in broad daylight. He told himself a great many things over the following days, and every one of them turned out to be a lie he had built to protect himself from a truth he was not ready to face. Homer took a room above the Larkspur Creek saloon under his false name, and he began the careful work of watching Dorothy Garrison. He watched her open the shop each morning at dawn, watched her work the forge until her arms shone with sweat, watched her close accounts for townsfolk who could not pay in full, and never once turn away a family in need of a repaired plow blade or a mended rifle. He watched her ride out twice a week to the Garrison homestead 3 miles north, where she kept a small herd of cattle and tended a garden that fed half the widows in town. Everything he saw contradicted the file in his pocket, and it gnawed at him like a splinter working deeper with every step. On the 4th day, he returned to collect his repaired revolver and found Dorothy in the back of the shop, bent over a long table covered in scattered brass casings and a disassembled Winchester rifle, muttering to herself in frustration. "Trouble?" Homer asked, leaning against the doorframe. Dorothy did not look up. "This rifle belongs to Henry Caldwell, whose eyesight has gone bad enough that he cannot see to hunt anymore, and whose son was killed at Little Bighorn 2 summers back, and who has no one left to bring meat to his table but me. The extractor is cracked, and I do not have a replacement part in the shop. I could forge one, but it would take 3 days I do not have, because I also promised the widow Thompson I would have her stove repaired before the next cold snap." Homer found himself stepping into the shop without deciding to. "I have some skill with metalwork," he said. "Learned it from my father before he passed." This, at least, was not entirely a lie. His father had been a blacksmith in Missouri before the war took him. "Let me see what I can do." Dorothy studied him again with that same assessing look, weighing him the way she might weigh a stranger's horse before a trade. "You are not what you appear to be, Mr. Boyle," she said slowly. "A drifter with soft hands does not usually know one end of a forge from the other." Homer's pulse quickened, the old fear of exposure rising fast and sharp. "I have done my share of hard living," he said, keeping his voice even. "Perhaps," Dorothy said, and something in her tone told him she did not entirely believe him but was choosing for now not to press. "Show me, then. If your hands are as capable as your words, I will not turn away the help." They worked side by side at the forge for 3 hours that afternoon, and Homer found himself watching her more than he watched the metal in his own hands. She worked with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, never wasting a single strike of the hammer, reading the color of heated steel with a glance the way other people read a printed page. When the extractor was finally shaped and fitted, she tested it against the rifle mechanism with fingers so steady and precise that Homer, a man who had disarmed outlaws and tracked killers across 4 territories, felt something close to awe settle in his chest. "You are good at this," he said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in years. "I had a good teacher," Dorothy said, and for a moment her guarded expression softened into something like grief. "My father used to say that a gunsmith who does not understand every piece of the weapon she repairs is no better than a butcher playing at surgery. He wanted precision. He wanted care. I try to honor that every day." "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Dorothy said. "And it was a good man who killed him in the end, though not with a bullet." Cornelius Vance choked the life out of this town's independence one contract at a time, and my father's lungs simply gave out trying to keep pace with the debts Vance's freight monopoly forced upon every rancher and shopkeeper within 50 miles. But that is a story for another day, Mr. Boyle, and not one I share with strangers freely. The name Cornelius Vance meant nothing to Homer yet, though it would come to mean everything before this was through. He filed it away in the same careful part of his mind, where he kept every clue, every lead, every fragment of information that might unravel the case the agency had sent him to close. But even as he did, he felt a small, treacherous voice inside him whispering that he was no longer simply gathering evidence. He was listening to Dorothy Garrison because he wanted to know her, wanted to understand the shape of her grief and her strength, wanted, against every rule of his profession, to be someone she trusted. That night in his rented room above the saloon, Homer sat with the agency file spread across his narrow bed and stared at the words until they blurred. Theft. Murder. Conspiracy. He thought of Dorothy's steady hands shaping steel, her fierce tenderness toward the towns forgotten and struggling, her grief over a father stolen by a rich man's greed rather than any violence of her own making. Nothing fit. Nothing about the woman he had spent the day beside matched the monster described in those pages, and for the first time in his career, Homer Hunter began to wonder if the agency, or the men who had commissioned this investigation, had sent him after the wrong person entirely. He did not yet know how right that suspicion was, nor how dangerous the truth would prove to be for both of them. Over the following 2 weeks, Homer found reasons to return to the gunsmith shop nearly every day. He told himself each time that it was necessary, that a good agent cultivated closeness to his target, that trust was simply a tool to be used and discarded when the case demanded it. But the excuses grew thinner with each visit, and the truth grew harder to deny. He sought Dorothy Garrison's company not for the case, but for herself. She taught him things he had never expected to learn from a woman half his size and twice as sharp-tongued. She showed him how to read the grain of steel by candlelight, how to judge the temper of a blade by the sound it made when struck, how to load a Winchester so fast that her hands were a blur even to his trained eye. One afternoon, when a drunken cattle drover made the mistake of grabbing her wrist across the counter and demanding she lower her prices, Homer watched in stunned silence as Dorothy disarmed the man's own knife from his belt in a single fluid motion, pressed it flat against the counter between them, and informed him in a voice cold as a winter creek that the price would now be double, and he was welcome to complain to the sheriff about a woman defending her own establishment. The drover left red-faced and empty-handed, and Homer found himself laughing before he could stop himself. "That was the finest thing I have seen a person do with a blade in a decade of hard living," he said, and he was not exaggerating. Dorothy allowed herself a rare, small smile, the kind that transformed her whole face from guarded severity into something luminous. My father taught me that a woman running a business alone on the frontier cannot afford to be helpless, Mr. Boyle. I learned to shoot before I learned to read. I learned to disarm a man before I learned to dance. Some might call that unnatural for a lady. I call it staying alive. I would call it remarkable, Homer said, and he watched something shift in her eyes at the word, some old wall lowering by an inch. It was in that unguarded moment that Homer began to understand the shape of what was happening to him. He had come to Larkspur Creek to capture a murderer and a thief, and instead he was falling, slowly and helplessly, in love with a woman whose intelligence humbled him, whose independence awed him, and whose kindness, witnessed 100 times in small acts toward the town's forgotten souls, made the charges in his file feel more impossible with every passing day. But an undercover agent's heart was a dangerous thing to trust, and Homer Hunter had not yet reckoned with how far the lies around Dorothy Garrison truly ran, nor how close the real danger was standing. The real trouble began on a Tuesday evening in early May, when Dorothy closed the shop later than usual and found Homer waiting for her outside, leaning against the hitching post with his hat tipped low against the setting sun. "You are here often for a man with no business needing repair," Dorothy said, though there was no real accusation in it, only the same probing curiosity that had colored her words since their first meeting. "Maybe I enjoy the company," Homer said. "Maybe you enjoy interrogating me without asking direct questions," Dorothy said, and Homer's stomach dropped like a stone through still water. "You watch me the way a lawman watches a suspect, Mr. Boyle. I have known enough Pinkerton men passing through this territory to recognize the look." For a long moment, Homer said nothing, his mind racing through a dozen possible lies, a dozen ways to deflect and deny. But looking at her standing there in the fading light, dust on her boots and steel in her spine, he found himself unable to summon a single false word. "What would you say," he asked slowly, "if I told you that you were right in part? That I came to this town believing terrible things about you, things written in a file by men who have never met you, men who called you a murderer and a thief?" Dorothy's face went very still. "I would say that explains a great deal about the way you look at me sometimes, as though you are trying to solve a puzzle you already believe you know the answer to." "And if I told you," Homer continued, his heart hammering against his ribs, "that every day I have spent in your company has made me believe those charges less and less, until I no longer believe them at all?" "I would ask," Dorothy said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "what charges you speak of exactly, so that I might finally understand why federal marshals rode through this territory 3 months ago asking questions about me to every rancher and shopkeeper for 50 miles, and why I have felt eyes on my back ever since, and why I have not slept a full night without a loaded rifle beside my bed since the spring thaw." Homer told her then, standing in the dusty street as the sun sank behind the western hills, everything the agency file contained: the theft of Wells Fargo gold, the poisoning of Marshal Ainsworth, the conspiracy to derail the payroll train. He watched her face move through shock, then fury, then a grief so deep it seemed to age her 10 years in the space of a single breath. "Marshal Ainsworth is dead," she whispered. "I did not know that. I swear to you on my father's grave I did not know that." "You knew him?" Homer asked. "He came to this town 4 months ago asking questions about Cornelius Vance's freight contracts," Dorothy said. "I gave him copies of ledgers my father kept before he died, records showing Vance had been bribing railroad officials and skimming payroll shipments for years, disguising the theft as accidents and derailments blamed on outlaws. Ainsworth said the evidence was enough to bring federal charges against Vance's entire operation. 3 weeks later I heard nothing more from him. I assumed he had simply moved on to build his case elsewhere. I did not know he was dead. I did not know anyone believed I had poisoned him." Homer felt the ground shifting beneath everything he thought he understood about this case. "The gold theft," he said. "The train derailment. Are you telling me Vance is behind all of it and has spent months building a case against you to hide his own crimes?" "I am telling you," Dorothy said, her green eyes blazing now with a fierce, cold clarity, "that Cornelius Vance owns half the merchants in this town through debt and threat, controls the only freight line between here and the railhead, and has wanted my father's gunsmithing business folded into his empire for a decade. My father refused every offer Vance made. When my father died, Vance offered to buy the shop from me at a fraction of its worth, and when I refused him just as my father had, he told me, in this very street, that he would find a way to take everything from me regardless of my wishes. I did not understand until this moment that he meant it so literally." Homer stood there in the gathering dusk, the full shape of the conspiracy unfolding before him with terrible clarity. He had been sent by the agency to capture a woman framed for crimes committed by a wealthy freight baron determined to eliminate the one person standing between him and total control of Larkspur Creek. And somewhere along the way, the man sent to destroy her had fallen completely and helplessly in love with her instead. "I have to tell you something else," Homer said, his voice rough with the weight of it. "My name is not Homer Boyle, it is Homer Hunter. I am a Pinkerton agent, sent here specifically to find you, to gain your trust, and eventually to bring you in for trial, using whatever means necessary, including, if the agency's instructions were followed to the letter, marriage under false pretenses to guarantee I could deliver you without a fight." Dorothy's face went white, then flushed with a fury so intense Homer half expected her to strike him across the face, and he would not have blamed her if she had. "You have been lying to me for 2 weeks," she said, her voice shaking. "Every conversation, every hour at the forge, every moment I began, against my better judgment, to trust you, has been a performance designed to deliver me into a noose. That is how it began," Homer said, refusing to look away from her even as shame burned through him. "I will not pretend otherwise, because you deserve nothing less than the truth now that I have finally found the courage to give it to you. But somewhere in these 2 weeks, Dorothy, it stopped being a performance. I do not know the exact moment it happened. Perhaps it was watching you disarm that drover with more skill than most lawmen I have trained beside. Perhaps it was hearing you speak of your father with such love and grief in the same breath. I only know that I would rather burn every page of that agency file than see a single hair on your head harmed, and that terrifies me more than any outlaw I have ever faced down." For a long, silent moment, Dorothy said nothing, and Homer feared he had destroyed whatever fragile trust had grown between them beyond any hope of repair. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "I do not know if I can trust a word you say ever again, Homer Hunter, if that is even your true name. But I know Cornelius Vance is dangerous, and I know that whoever murdered Marshal Ainsworth is still walking free in this territory, likely planning his next move against me even as we stand here talking. If you truly wish to prove your feelings are more than another lie, you will help me find the evidence to clear my name and bring the real conspirators to justice, before Vance finds a way to see me hanged for crimes I never committed." "I swear to you," Homer said, "on whatever honor I have left after these 2 weeks of deception, I will not rest until the truth is known and you are safe. Whatever it costs me with the agency, whatever it costs me personally, I choose you, Dorothy Garrison. I should have chosen you from the very first day. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and in the deepening twilight of that Wyoming street, Homer Hunter understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no returning. He was no longer an agent pursuing a target. He was a man fighting for the life and the love of the woman who had, without ever intending to, become the truest thing he had ever known. The following days were a careful, dangerous dance of investigation and growing intimacy. Dorothy retrieved copies of her father's ledgers from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the family homestead, documents she had kept safe since Marshal Ainsworth's visit, documents that detailed years of Cornelius Vance's systematic theft from railroad payroll shipments, disguised through falsified freight manifests and bribed officials along the Union Pacific line. My father was careful, Dorothy explained, spreading the ledgers across the table in the back room of the gunsmith shop, the same table where Homer had first helped her forge a rifle part weeks before. He recorded every discrepancy in Vance's freight contracts for 6 years before he died, hoping someday to bring the evidence to a federal judge who could not be bought. He never got the chance. I inherited both the ledgers and the danger they represented, without ever fully understanding how far Vance would go to silence anyone who threatened him. Homer studied the careful, precise handwriting filling page after page, cross-referencing dates of supposed train robberies and derailments with dates when Vance's own freight wagons had suspiciously avoided the same routes. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone trained to read it, and Homer had spent 11 years learning to read exactly this kind of pattern. "This is enough to convict him," Homer said. "If we can get this in front of a federal judge in Cheyenne, along with testimony connecting Vance to Ainsworth's murder, the charges against you would collapse entirely, and Vance would face trial for his own crimes instead." "If," Dorothy said grimly. "Vance has spent a decade building relationships with every judge and official between here and Cheyenne. He will not simply allow us to walk into a courthouse with evidence that would destroy him. We need proof of the murder itself, not simply the financial crimes, if we hope to see real justice done." It was Dorothy who suggested the plan that would ultimately expose the truth, a plan born of her sharp intelligence and her intimate knowledge of the town's dynamics that Homer, for all his training, could never have devised alone. She proposed that they draw out Vance's hired men, the same men who had likely poisoned Marshal Ainsworth on Vance's orders, by allowing word to spread through town that Dorothy possessed additional evidence beyond the ledgers already known, evidence that could be obtained only by force. "You want to use yourself as bait," Homer said, horror rising in his chest at the thought. "I want to control the moment when Vance's men come for me," Dorothy corrected, "rather than allowing them to choose the time and place at their convenience, likely when I am alone and unprepared. I have spent my whole life learning to defend myself, Homer. I do not intend to spend my final days running from a fight I am capable of winning, if given the chance to choose the terms." Homer wanted desperately to refuse, to insist she remain hidden while he pursued the investigation through safer channels, but he had learned enough about Dorothy Garrison in these weeks to understand that such an insistence would only insult the very qualities that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. She was not a woman who needed protecting from danger. She was a woman who needed a partner willing to stand beside her while she faced it. "Then we do it together," Homer said. "Not as your protector and not as your handler, but as your partner in this, for as long as you will have me." Dorothy studied him for a long moment, something softening in her fierce green eyes. "For as long as I will have you," she repeated slowly. "That sounds almost like a proposal, Agent Hunter." "Perhaps it is," Homer said, and found himself smiling despite the danger gathering around them. "Though I suspect you would want to negotiate the terms rather extensively before accepting." "You suspect correctly," Dorothy said, but her voice carried a warmth that had not been there before, a warmth that told Homer, more clearly than any words could have, that the wound of his initial deception was beginning, slowly and carefully, to heal. They spent the following week laying careful groundwork for the trap, working alongside a small circle of trusted allies Dorothy had cultivated through years of quiet kindness toward the town's forgotten. Henry Caldwell, the aging rancher whose rifle Homer had helped repair, agreed to spread word through the saloon that Dorothy had spoken carelessly of additional evidence hidden at her homestead. The widow Thompson, grateful for years of Dorothy's generosity, agreed to watch the roads leading to the Garrison property and send warning if strangers approached. "And Homer, using his agency credentials for what he now understood to be their true and proper purpose, sent an urgent telegram to the federal judge in Cheyenne, requesting that he hold himself available to review evidence of a conspiracy reaching far beyond the charges originally filed against Dorothy Garrison. Through it all, something else was growing between them, something that had nothing to do with the danger surrounding them and everything to do with the simple, powerful truth of two people who understood and respected each other completely. Evening after evening, once the careful planning was finished, they would sit together on the porch of Dorothy's homestead, watching the sun set over the endless Wyoming grassland, and Homer found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul. "I joined the agency after the war," he told her one evening, the crickets singing in the tall grass around them. "I had seen enough death and enough injustice in those years to want to spend my life stopping it wherever I found it. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the people behind the files. I started seeing only the charges, the warrants, the wanted posters. You reminded me, Dorothy, that every case has a human being at its center, and that human beings deserve to be seen clearly before they are judged. My father used to say something similar about his work," Dorothy said, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural between them over the past days, though neither had yet spoken plainly of the depth of what they felt. "He said a gunsmith who forgets that every weapon he repairs might one day save a life or take one has forgotten the weight of his responsibility. I think perhaps every profession carries that same danger, Homer. The danger of forgetting the human cost hidden inside our daily work." "I will never forget it again," Homer said quietly. "Not after knowing you." She lifted her head to look at him then, and in the fading purple light of the Wyoming dusk, Homer Hunter leaned down and kissed Dorothy Garrison for the first time, a kiss that carried within it every unspoken apology, every quiet hope, every fierce and tender feeling that had grown between them across these strange and dangerous weeks. She kissed him back with equal intensity, her hand rising to rest against his jaw, and when they finally parted, both of them breathless, Dorothy laughed softly, a sound of pure and unguarded joy that Homer had not yet heard from her. "I did not expect," she said, "to fall in love with the very man sent to destroy me." "I did not expect," Homer replied, "to find in my target the finest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. Perhaps we are both fools, Dorothy Garrison. Perhaps," she said, "we are simply two people who found each other despite every reason not to. I have learned in my life that the frontier does not often reward caution above courage. Perhaps love is no different." Their happiness, however, was to be short-lived, for even as they sat together beneath the darkening sky, Cornelius Vance's men were already moving against them, and the trap Dorothy had so carefully designed was about to spring far sooner, and far more violently, than either of them had anticipated. 3 nights later, the warning came just past midnight. The widow Thompson's youngest son came pounding on the door of the homestead, breathless from running the full 3 miles from town, to report that he had seen 4 riders passing through Larkspur Creek an hour before, heading north along the very road that led to Dorothy's homestead, and that he had recognized one of them as Silas Cobb, a known enforcer in Cornelius Vance's employ, a man with a reputation for violence that had earned him a wide berth from every honest citizen in 3 counties. Homer was already reaching for his revolver before the boy finished speaking, while Dorothy moved with equal speed toward the gun cabinet built into the wall of her modest home, retrieving not 1 but 2 Winchester rifles, checking the loads on each with the same swift precision Homer had watched her apply to every mechanism she had ever repaired. "How long until they arrive?" Homer asked. "If they ride hard, 20 minutes, Dorothy said. "If they are cautious, perhaps 30. Either way, not long enough for us to send for help from town, and expect it to arrive in time." "Then we prepare to defend ourselves," Homer said, "and we hope the evidence we have already sent to Cheyenne is enough to bring justice even if tonight goes badly." "Tonight will not go badly," Dorothy said, and there was such fierce, unshakable confidence in her voice that Homer felt his own fear steady into something closer to determination. "I have defended this homestead against wolves, against cattle thieves, and against men far more dangerous than Sela's Cobb. I do not intend to lose it or you tonight." They positioned themselves with the practiced efficiency of two people who had spent the past week planning for exactly this eventuality, Homer taking position at the front window, with a clear line of sight down the approach road, Dorothy moving to the rear of the house, where a second, less obvious approach existed through the barn and outbuildings. They had agreed, in their careful planning, that whoever came would likely try to surround the house, and Dorothy had insisted, over Homer's initial objections, that she take the more dangerous rear position precisely because her knowledge of the property's terrain gave her the advantage there. The riders arrived 23 minutes later, exactly as Dorothy had predicted, four shapes moving through the darkness with the careful, practiced stealth of men accustomed to violence. Homer watched from the front window as they split into pairs, two men moving toward the front of the house while two others circled toward the barn, and his heart clenched with fear for Dorothy even as he forced himself to remain focused on his own position. The first shots came from the barn, not from the attackers but from Dorothy herself, two precise rifle cracks that dropped one of Vance's men before he had even cleared the corner of the structure. Homer heard a cry of pain and surprise, followed by the second attacker's frantic return fire, wild and undisciplined against Dorothy's calm, deadly accuracy. At the front of the house, the remaining two men had apparently heard the shots and hesitated, uncertain whether to press forward or retreat, and Homer used that hesitation to his advantage, stepping out onto the porch with his revolver raised. "This is Agent Homer Hunter of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency," he called into the darkness, his voice carrying the full authority of 11 years wearing that badge. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and armed assault. Lower your weapons now, or face the consequences of resisting federal law enforcement." One of the men, apparently more sensible than his companions, immediately dropped his rifle and raised his hands, but the other, a broad-shouldered figure Homer recognized from Dorothy's description as Sela's Cobb himself, raised his weapon instead, firing wildly toward the porch. Homer returned fire with the precision drilled into him across 11 years of dangerous work, and Cobb fell with a cry, wounded in the shoulder but very much alive. From the rear of the property came a final exchange of gunfire, and then silence, a silence that stretched agonizingly long before Dorothy's voice called out, strong and clear across the darkness. "Homer, I'm unharmed. The second man has surrendered." Relief flooded through Homer with such force that his knees nearly buckled beneath him, and he understood in that moment, with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life, exactly how deeply and completely he had come to love Dorothy Garrison. They spent the remainder of that long night securing their prisoners and tending to Cobb's wound sufficiently to ensure he would survive to face trial, for his testimony, Homer knew, would prove essential in unraveling the full extent of Vance's conspiracy. As dawn broke pink and gold over the Wyoming plains, Homer finally allowed himself to cross the yard to where Dorothy stood beside the barn, her rifle still in hand, her face streaked with dust but her eyes bright with the fierce satisfaction of a woman who had successfully defended everything she held dear. "You saved us," Homer said, pulling her into his arms without hesitation, uncaring who might witness the gesture. "Your plan, your skill, your courage. I have fought beside trained lawmen who could not have executed that defense with half your precision, Dorothy." "We saved us," Dorothy corrected, though she allowed herself to lean into his embrace, some of the fierce tension finally draining from her shoulders. "I could not have done this without you, Homer, any more than you could have done it without me. That is what partnership means, is it not? Neither of us carrying the full weight alone." It was in the golden light of that Wyoming dawn, surrounded by the aftermath of violence they had faced together and survived together, that Homer Hunter finally understood the full truth of what had happened to him over these past weeks. He had come to Larkspur Creek to capture a target. He had found instead a partner, an equal, a woman whose strength matched and in many ways exceeded his own, and whose love, freely and fiercely given despite every reason for suspicion and betrayal, had transformed him into a better man than the one who had first ridden into this town under a false name. But their victory that night, however sweet, was not yet complete, for Silas Cobb's surviving companion, once questioned, revealed that Cornelius Vance himself had traveled to Larkspur Creek only that morning, intending to personally ensure that Dorothy Garrison would trouble him no longer, and that his current location, according to the frightened prisoner, was the old livery stable at the edge of town, where he waited for confirmation that his hired men had succeeded in silencing her forever. This news set into motion the final, most dangerous confrontation of their ordeal, the one that would bring them, ultimately, to the burning barn where Homer's story had begun, though neither of them yet knew how close they stood to that terrible moment. Homer wanted to ride immediately for the sheriff, to bring proper legal authority to bear against Vance before attempting any confrontation, but Dorothy argued, with the same sharp logic that had guided every decision she had made throughout this ordeal, that Vance likely had the local sheriff, a man named Purdy who had held his position for 6 years through Vance's financial backing, thoroughly under his influence, and that any warning might allow Vance to flee before facing justice for his crimes. "We need someone above local corruption," Dorothy said. "You said yourself you sent evidence to a federal judge in Cheyenne. Has he responded?" Homer checked the telegram he had received just the previous evening, before the attack on the homestead had consumed all his attention. "Judge Alden Whitmore has agreed to review the evidence personally, and states he will arrive in Larkspur Creek within 3 days accompanied by federal marshals, provided the evidence proves as significant as I described." 3 days, Dorothy said grimly. "Vance will not wait 3 days once he learns his men have failed. We need to secure him now, before he can flee this territory entirely and disappear into whatever hole a man of his wealth can purchase." It was Dorothy who devised the plan to confront Vance directly, using the very evidence her father had gathered against him, presented in such a way that Vance would have no choice but to either confess in front of witnesses or attempt violence that would clearly establish his guilt beyond any question. Homer argued fiercely against the danger of the plan, but found himself, as he increasingly did, persuaded by the sheer clarity and courage of Dorothy's reasoning. "I have spent my entire adult life being underestimated by men like Cornelius Vance," Dorothy said, loading her rifle with steady, deliberate movements. "He believes me a helpless woman who can be framed and eliminated without consequence. I intend to prove him catastrophically wrong, Homer, and I intend to do it while there are enough witnesses present that he cannot simply have us both quietly disposed of before the judge arrives." They rode into Larkspur Creek that afternoon, having first sent word through Henry Caldwell and the widow Thompson to gather as many townsfolk as possible at the livery stable, under the pretense that Dorothy intended to make a public statement regarding the charges against her. By the time they arrived, a substantial crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and the town's collective awareness that something significant was unfolding in their midst. Cornelius Vance stood near the entrance of the livery stable when they arrived, a tall, silver-haired man whose expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him clearly as a person of wealth and influence, his expression carefully composed into a mask of concerned civility that Homer recognized immediately as the practiced performance of a man accustomed to manipulating those around him. "Miss Garrison," Vance said smoothly, "I understand you have suffered some manner of attack at your homestead. I came as soon as I heard, deeply concerned for your welfare, as I have always been concerned for the welfare of this town's citizens." "Your concern is touching, Mr. Vance," Dorothy said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, particularly given that the men who attacked my home were in your employ and confessed as much before federal witnesses. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Vance's composed expression flickered just barely before he recovered. That is a serious accusation, Miss Garrison, and I would remind you that making false claims against a man of my standing carries its own legal consequences. They are not false claims, Homer said, stepping forward and producing his Pinkerton credentials for the crowd to see. I am Agent Homer Hunter of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and I have in my possession documentary evidence, gathered by Miss Garrison's late father over 6 years, proving that Cornelius Vance has systematically defrauded the Union Pacific Railroad and its shipping contracts, disguising his theft through falsified accidents and derailments blamed on outlaws, and more recently, on Miss Garrison herself. Furthermore, Dorothy continued, her voice unwavering despite the gathering tension in the crowd around them, I have testimony, obtained just this morning from one of the men who attacked my homestead, confirming that Marshal Thaddeus Ainsworth was murdered on your direct orders, Mr. Vance, after he discovered evidence of your crimes and threatened to bring federal charges against you. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and Homer watched Vance's carefully constructed composure finally begin to crack, his eyes darting toward the edges of the crowd as though searching for some avenue of escape. It was in that moment of desperation that Vance made his fatal mistake, reaching beneath his expensive coat for a hidden derringer, apparently intending either to silence Dorothy permanently or to force his way through the crowd by threat of violence. Homer saw the movement a fraction of a second before Vance's hand cleared his coat, and he lunged forward, knocking the older man's arm aside just as the small pistol discharged, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the dirt at their feet. The crowd scattered with cries of alarm, and in the chaos that followed, several of the town's men, led by Henry Caldwell himself, swarmed forward to help Homer subdue and disarm Vance before he could attempt any further violence. But the confrontation was not yet finished, for in the panic of the moment, someone, likely one of Vance's few remaining loyal employees present in the crowd, had thrown a lantern against the wall of the livery stable in an attempt to create a diversion allowing Vance's escape, and the dry timber of the old structure caught fire with terrifying speed, flames racing up the walls even as the crowd fought to restrain Vance and simultaneously flee the spreading blaze. It was here that the story returned at last to the moment where it had begun, though the truth of that moment was very different from what the opening confrontation had suggested. For it was not Homer holding a gun to Dorothy's head in suspicion of her guilt, but rather a final, desperate act by one of Vance's men, a younger enforcer named Jesse Dunmore who had not yet been apprehended in the chaos, who seized Dorothy from behind as the fire spread, intending to use her as a hostage to secure Vance's escape from the gathering crowd of angry townsfolk. "Let her go," Homer shouted, his own revolver raised but unable to fire clearly with Dunmore using Dorothy as a shield, the flames of the burning barn casting wild, dancing shadows across the chaotic scene. "This ends now, Dunmore. Vance is finished. There is nowhere left for you to run." "I will kill her," Dunmore shouted back, panic evident in his voice, a knife now pressed against Dorothy's throat rather than the gun Homer's memory would later, in the retelling, transform into that opening image of confrontation. For it was in this moment of genuine terror, watching the woman he loved held at knife point before a burning building, that Homer Hunter felt his entire world narrow to a single point of absolute, desperate focus. But Dorothy Garrison had not survived years of running an independent business on the frontier, had not learned to defend herself against wolves and thieves and men who underestimated her strength, only to become a helpless hostage in the final moments of her own vindication. As Dunmore's attention flickered toward Homer, distracted by his shouted demands, Dorothy drove her elbow backward into his ribs with a force that drove the air from his lungs, twisting free of his grip even as the knife's blade opened a shallow cut along her forearm. And in the same fluid motion, she seized his wrist and forced the knife from his hand before he could recover his balance. Homer fired a single shot, striking Dunmore in the leg as he attempted to flee, dropping him to the ground where several townsfolk quickly moved to restrain him before he could cause further harm. And it was in the immediate aftermath of that desperate struggle, with the barn fully engulfed in flames behind her and blood running down her arm from the shallow knife wound, that Dorothy Garrison turned to face Homer Hunter, her chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, and Homer felt the full, overwhelming force of his love for her crash over him like a physical wave. "Are you hurt?" he asked, closing the distance between them in 3 quick strides, his hands moving to examine the cut on her arm with a gentleness that belied the violence of the moment they had just survived. "It is shallow," Dorothy said, though her voice shook slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "I will need it cleaned and bandaged, but I will live, Homer. We both will." Around them, the crowd worked to contain the burning barn, forming a bucket line from the nearby well while others secured Vance, Cobb, Dunmore, and their remaining accomplices for the sheriff's custody. Though Homer noted grimly that Sheriff Purdy himself had conveniently failed to appear during the entire confrontation, a fact that would later prove significant when Judge Whitmore's investigation revealed the extent of Purdy's complicity in Vance's corruption. That night, as the flames of the burned livery stable finally died to smoldering embers, and the town slowly returned to an uneasy calm, Homer sat beside Dorothy in the modest front room of her homestead, carefully cleaning and bandaging the wound on her arm while she recounted, with remarkable steadiness given the day's events, the full details of the confrontation for the benefit of the written statement Homer would need to prepare for Judge Whitmore's arrival. "You saved my life tonight," Dorothy said quietly, once the bandaging was complete, "when you knocked Vance's Derringer aside before he could fire it directly at me. And I suppose I returned the favor when I freed myself from Dunmore before he could carry out his threat. Perhaps this is simply how it will always be between us, Homer, each of us saving the other over and over, for as long as we are fortunate enough to share this life." "I would not have it any other way," Homer said, taking her uninjured hand in both of his own. "I came to this town believing I understood the difference between justice and injustice, between guilt and innocence, between duty and desire. You have taught me, Dorothy Garrison, that the world is far more complicated than any file or warrant could ever capture, and that the finest justice comes not from blind obedience to authority, but from the courage to see truth clearly, even when it costs us everything we thought we understood about ourselves. That is a great deal of philosophy for a man who spent the evening exchanging gunfire with hired killers," Dorothy said, though her tone was warm with affection rather than mockery. "Perhaps," Homer said, "but I have found that facing death with someone tends to clarify a man's priorities rather quickly. I love you, Dorothy Garrison. I have loved you, I think, since the very first afternoon you scolded me for neglecting my revolver's firing pin, though I was too much a fool and too bound by duty to recognize it clearly until circumstances forced my hand." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled through them, a smile of such pure and unguarded joy that Homer felt his heart nearly break with the beauty of it. "I love you as well, Homer Hunter," she said. "Despite every reason caution should have counseled against it, despite the lies that began our acquaintance, despite everything that has tried to keep us apart these past weeks. I love you and I choose you, and whatever comes when Judge Whitmore arrives, I want to face it standing beside you." They kissed then, slowly and tenderly, a kiss that carried within it the full weight of everything they had survived together, and everything they hoped to build in the days and years that stretched ahead of them, however uncertain those days might yet prove to be. Judge Alden Whitmore arrived in Larkspur Creek 3 days later, exactly as he had promised, accompanied by 4 federal marshals whose presence quickly established the seriousness with which the federal government now regarded the situation. Over the following 2 weeks, a thorough investigation unfolded, drawing upon Dorothy's father's meticulous ledgers, the testimony of Silas Cobb and Jesse Dunmore, both of whom, facing lengthy prison sentences of their own, proved eager to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, and the physical evidence gathered from Vance's own office and financial records, which corroborated every detail of the conspiracy Dorothy had uncovered. The truth, once fully assembled, painted a damning picture of Cornelius Vance's decade-long scheme. He had systematically defrauded the Union Pacific Railroad of tens of thousands of dollars through falsified freight contracts and staged robberies, using the resulting chaos to eliminate competition and consolidate control over the region's shipping industry. When Dorothy's father had begun documenting these crimes, Vance had applied increasing financial pressure to the family's gunsmithing business, hoping to force its sale and silence the growing threat to his empire. When that pressure failed and Marshal Ainsworth began investigating based on evidence Dorothy had provided after her father's death, Vance had ordered the marshal's murder, disguising the poisoning as illness, and had subsequently orchestrated an elaborate framing of Dorothy Garrison herself, using his considerable influence with corrupt officials, including Sheriff Purdy, to ensure that federal attention would focus on her rather than on his own crimes. Sheriff Purdy, faced with overwhelming evidence of his complicity, ultimately confessed to accepting bribes from Vance in exchange for suppressing investigation into the freight baron's activities, and for actively promoting the false charges against Dorothy to federal authorities. Both men were taken into federal custody to await trial, along with Vance's remaining hired enforcers, and Judge Whitmore personally assured Dorothy that given the overwhelming evidence of her innocence and the clear documentation of the conspiracy against her, all charges against her would be formally dismissed within the month. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Garrison," Judge Whitmore told her, on the final evening of his visit to Larkspur Creek, as they sat together in the modest front room of the gunsmith's shop, reviewing the final details of the case. "In 11 years on the federal bench, I have rarely seen such thorough and courageous documentation of criminal conspiracy assembled by a private citizen, let alone one who simultaneously found herself the target of that very conspiracy. Your father would be proud of the courage you have shown in bringing this matter to justice, and I suspect, having observed the two of you these past weeks, that he would also approve of the man who stood beside you throughout this ordeal." Homer, seated beside Dorothy with her hand held firmly in his own, felt a warmth spread through his chest at the judge's words, though it was nothing compared to the warmth he felt whenever Dorothy simply looked at him with the open, unguarded love that had grown between them across these transformative weeks. "I could not have uncovered the truth without Agent Hunter's assistance," Dorothy said graciously, "nor without his willingness to abandon his original assignment once he understood the truth of my innocence, at considerable risk to his own standing with the agency that employed him." This last point proved to be a matter of considerable concern in the weeks that followed, for while Judge Whitmore's formal dismissal of all charges against Dorothy Garrison represented a complete legal vindication, Homer's own position with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency remained deeply uncertain. He had, after all, abandoned his assigned mission, fallen in love with his target, and ultimately worked to prove her innocence rather than deliver her to the justice his employers had originally demanded. When he finally submitted his full report to the agency's regional office in Cheyenne, detailing the entire conspiracy and his role in exposing it, he fully expected termination from the only profession he had known since the war's end. Instead, the response that arrived 3 weeks later surprised him considerably. The agency's regional director, having reviewed the full details of the case and recognizing the significant public attention the successful prosecution of Cornelius Vance had generated, praised Homer's work in uncovering a conspiracy far more significant than the agency had originally understood, and offered him a substantial commendation, along with the option of continued employment, provided he wished to remain in the agency's service. Homer found himself, for the first time in 11 years, uncertain whether he wished to accept. "What troubles you?" Dorothy asked, finding him sitting alone on the porch of her homestead one evening, the agency's letter held loosely in his hands as he stared out across the darkening plains. "I have spent my entire adult life defining myself by this work," Homer said slowly. "The badge, the pursuit of justice, the constant movement from one territory to the next in service of the agency's demands. But these past weeks with you have shown me a different kind of life is possible, Dorothy. A life built around a place, around people I love, around work that serves a community rather than simply chasing warrants across an endless frontier. I find myself wondering if I am ready to leave that old life behind entirely." "What would you do instead?" Dorothy asked, settling beside him on the porch steps. "I have some skill with metalwork, as you well know," Homer said, a small smile beginning to form despite the seriousness of his contemplation. "I was thinking perhaps a gunsmith shop could use a second set of skilled hands, particularly one belonging to a man who has grown rather fond of both the work and the woman who taught it to him." Dorothy's eyes widened with surprise, and then filled with a joy so complete that Homer felt any remaining doubt about his decision melt away entirely. "You would give up your career with the agency, your reputation, everything you have built these past 11 years, to become a gunsmith in Larkspur Creek." "I would give up a career that asked me to see people as targets rather than human beings," Homer said, "to build a life alongside the finest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. That does not feel like sacrifice to me, Dorothy. It feels like the first truly wise decision I have made in a very long time." Dorothy kissed him then, long and deep, and when they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his with a tenderness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of the depth of love that had grown between them across these transformative weeks. "I have one further condition," Dorothy said, a teasing note entering her voice even as her eyes remained bright with unshed tears of happiness. "Before I agree to share my forge, my business, and apparently my life with you, Homer Hunter." "Name it," Homer said. "You will marry me," Dorothy said, "properly, before a legitimate minister, with the full and enthusiastic blessing of this entire town, so that no one will ever again have cause to question the true and honest nature of what exists between us. I have had quite enough of false identities and hidden motives to last a lifetime, and I intend to build the remainder of my life on nothing but complete and transparent truth." "Dorothy Garrison," Homer said, taking both her hands in his own and looking into her eyes with all the sincerity his heart could hold, "it would be the greatest honor of my life to marry you, properly and truthfully, before this entire town and before God himself. I love you completely, without reservation, and I intend to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of the trust you have so generously extended to me despite every reason you had to withhold it." They were married 6 weeks later, on a warm June afternoon, in a ceremony held in the town square of Larkspur Creek, attended by nearly every resident of the town whose lives Dorothy had touched through years of quiet generosity. Henry Caldwell walked her down the makeshift aisle formed by rows of wooden chairs, standing in for the father she had lost. His rifle, the very one Homer had helped repair those months before, slung proudly across his back as a symbol of the bonds that held this community together. The widow Thompson had organized the townswomen to prepare a feast that filled 3 long tables, and even Judge Whitmore, having returned to Larkspur Creek to finalize the sentencing of Vance and his co-conspirators, stayed an extra day to witness the ceremony, remarking that he had rarely seen a happier ending to such a troubled case in all his years on the bench. Cornelius Vance, along with Sheriff Purdy, Silas Cobb, and Jesse Dunmore, ultimately received lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy, the murder of Marshall Ainsworth, and the attempted framing of Dorothy Garrison, their combined testimony and the overwhelming physical evidence leaving no room for any legal defense to succeed. Vance's freight monopoly was dismantled entirely, its assets distributed among the ranchers and shopkeepers he had exploited for years, restoring a measure of economic independence to a town that had long suffered beneath his controlling influence. Homer formally resigned from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency the following month, though he maintained a cordial correspondence with several former colleagues, and occasionally, in the years that followed, provided informal consultation on cases involving frontier gunsmithing evidence, his expertise proving valuable even after he had traded his badge for a blacksmith's apron. He and Dorothy expanded Garrison Ironworks and gunsmithing together, their combined skills and reputation for honest, careful work drawing customers from increasingly distant corners of the territory. And within 2 years, they had saved sufficient funds to construct a larger forge and a comfortable house on the homestead property, where Dorothy's cattle herd grew alongside their prosperity. Their partnership, both in business and in marriage, remained exactly what it had been from the earliest days of their courtship, an equal collaboration between two people who respected each other's strengths completely. Dorothy continued to handle the most delicate and technically demanding repairs, her reputation as the finest gunsmith in the territory only growing with each passing year, while Homer's steady hands and growing skill made him an invaluable partner at the forge, and his easy manner with customers, honed across years of undercover work, brought a warmth to the shop's front counter that complemented Dorothy's more reserved, businesslike demeanor perfectly. 3 years after their wedding, Dorothy gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thaddeus, in honor of the marshal whose murder had set in motion the chain of events that ultimately brought Homer and Dorothy together, and whose memory, they agreed, deserved to be carried forward by the very justice his death had ultimately helped secure. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Rebecca after Dorothy's mother, who had died when Dorothy was still a young girl, leaving her father to raise her alone amid the forge and the anvil that would come to define her extraordinary life. Homer often found himself, in quiet moments at the forge or on the porch of their homestead, watching their children play in the tall Wyoming grass, reflecting on the strange and winding path that had brought him to this life of unexpected happiness. He had come to Larkspur Creek as an undercover agent, bound by duty and false identity, prepared to see Dorothy Garrison delivered to justice regardless of the human cost. He had found instead a woman whose intelligence, courage, and fierce independence had shattered every assumption he carried about the world and about his own hardened heart, and who had taught him, through her example, that true strength lay not in the pursuit of unquestioning duty, but in the courage to see truth clearly and to act upon it, whatever the cost. Dorothy, for her part, often told their children, as they grew older, the story of how their parents had met, careful to include every detail of the danger and deception that had marked those early weeks, for she believed firmly that children deserved to understand the complicated truth of the world rather than a simplified fable. "Your father came to arrest me," she would tell them, seated by the fire on winter evenings while Homer worked at his ledgers nearby, a small smile playing at his lips as he listened to the familiar tale. "He believed every terrible thing written about me in a file prepared by men who had never once bothered to meet me or understand my true character. But your father was wise enough and brave enough to look past those false accusations and see the truth standing before him. That is the most important lesson I can teach either of you, my darlings. Never accept what others tell you about a person's character without seeking the truth for yourselves, no matter how official or authoritative the source of that judgment might claim to be. And your mother, Homer would always add at this point in the story, setting aside his ledger to gather his children close, showed me that true strength has nothing to do with the size of a person's hands or the loudness of their voice. Your mother defended her home against armed men with nothing but her rifle and her courage, solved a conspiracy that had eluded federal marshals for months, and forgave a man who had lied to her for weeks, all because she possessed a clarity of judgment and a strength of character that I had never before encountered in any person, man or woman, in all my years of hard living across this territory. I fell in love with her because she was the strongest, most capable person I had ever met, and every day of our life together has only confirmed how right that first impression proved to be. In the years that followed, Larkspur Creek grew from a small frontier settlement into a thriving town, its prosperity no longer choked by the monopolistic grip of a single corrupt freight baron, its citizens free to build their own futures through honest labor and mutual support, much as Dorothy's father had always envisioned when he first built his forge with his own hands in 1869. Garrison Iron Works and Gunsmithing, now bearing a second name painted proudly alongside the first, Garrison and Hunter, became a landmark of the town's history, a testament to the courage and love of the two people who had built it together against every obstacle placed in their path. Homer Hunter never regretted the choice he had made that long-ago spring, trading the pursuit of duty for the pursuit of a life built on truth and partnership and love. And Dorothy Garrison, who had once believed she would spend her life alone, defending her father's legacy against the endless pressures of a world that sought to diminish and control her simply because of her sex, found in Homer a partner who saw her strength not as a threat to be managed, but as the very quality he loved most completely. They grew old together in that Wyoming homestead, watching their children marry and build families of their own, watching the town they had helped save from Cornelius Vance's corruption flourish into a place of genuine community and opportunity. And never once, in all the decades that followed that fateful spring of 1878, did either of them doubt the choice that had brought them together, nor the love that had grown from such unlikely and dangerous beginnings into the truest and most enduring partnership either had ever known. On quiet evenings, when the work of the forge was done and their grown children had returned to their own homes scattered across the growing town, Homer and Dorothy would still sit together on the porch where they had first spoken openly of their feelings so many years before, watching the sun set golden and orange over the endless plains, and Homer would often take her weathered, capable hand in his own and think, with a gratitude that never dimmed across the passing decades, of how close he had come to losing everything that mattered most, and how grateful he remained that truth, in the end, had proven stronger than every lie that had once stood between them. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked him once, many years later, as gray had begun to touch both their heads and their children's children played in the yard below. "The career you left behind, the life you might have had if you had simply completed your original assignment and moved on to the next case, the next territory, the next pursuit." Homer considered the question seriously, as he considered all questions Dorothy posed to him, for he had learned across their years together that her questions always carried a depth worth honoring with genuine reflection. "I regret," he said finally, "only the weeks I spent believing a lie about your character, and the pain that deception caused you before I found the courage to speak the truth. But the choice to stay, to build this life with you, to trade one kind of pursuit for another far more meaningful one, that, Dorothy Garrison Hunter, remains the finest decision I have ever made, and I would make it again 1,000 times over, in 1,000 different lives, if it always led me back to you." Dorothy smiled then, the same luminous smile that had first captured his heart across the counter of a small gunsmith shop so many years before, and leaned into his embrace as the Wyoming sun set gold and glorious across the land they had built their life upon together. Two partners, two equals, bound not by duty or deception, but by a love that had proven in the end stronger than every lie, every danger, and every obstacle the frontier had placed in their path. And so their story ended not with the violence and suspicion of its beginning, but with the quiet, enduring peace of a love fully realized, a partnership fully honored, and a truth finally and completely triumphant over every falsehood that had once threatened to keep two remarkable people apart.